For thousands of years, humans have sailed the world's oceans in search of new lands. Semi-mythical tales speak of the Polynesians discovering New Zealand, while the Phoenicians were the first to brave the uncharted waters that lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules in search of precious metals. These cultures laid the foundations for international trade and travel as we know it. While humanity has greatly benefited from the ability to sail the oceans, individuals have also sought to benefit from this ability in malevolent ways. In time, piracy arose from the aspiration to take humanity beyond the waves in search of the unknown. From times immortal, these malicious groups have sought to apprehend goods and even people, often selling them to the highest bidders. A life of piracy wasn't for the faint-hearted. It was harsh and dangerous, with few experiencing longevity. But no part of their existence sends chills down the spine quite like the tales of victims who were condemned to sinister punishments such as gibbetting and keel hauling. Join us in this video as we embark on a journey of our own across the 7 seas and investigate how cruel these punishments really were during the golden age of piracy. From being brutally dragged against the ship to the display of human bodies, come along as we explore this dark period of human history using eyewitness accounts to truly shed light on the inhuman horror of history's most brutal pirate punishments. Piracy is a tale as old as time. The word is generally applied to any malevolent individual or group who attempts to raid a ship at sea. Defined by the International Maritime Bureau as the act of boarding any vessel with an intent to commit theft or any other crime, and with an intent or capacity to use force in furtherance of that act, piracy rose to unprecedented heights during the early modern era. References to what we'd refer to as piracy take us back to the height of the New Kingdom of Egypt. Around 150 BC, the pharaoh Akhenaten authorized a clay tablet that described freelance Mediterranean shipping attacks in North Africa. Several centuries later, Ramses II was forced to defend Egypt against a group of pirates known collectively as the Sea Peoples. While it is difficult to pinpoint the true origin of piracy, we can be confident that as long as ships carrying valuable goods have sailed the oceans, malicious groups have sought to steal them. The origin of the word pirate comes to us from the Roman historian Polybius, who first used pirato to define a band of hostile sailors around 140 BC. Several centuries later, the Greek historian Plutarch provided the oldest clear definition of piracy around 100 AD, describing pirates as those who attack ships and maritime cities without legal authority. From this point onwards, we see it referenced on many occasions, and it remained a stagnant problem that only intensified with time. By the 17th century, we entered into what's known as the Golden Era of piracy, a period in which historians propose as many as 5,000 pirates roamed and terrorized the seas. During this era, we also saw the rise of several heinous punishments that startle researchers to this day, some of which were invented not by pirates, but by organized navies. In the next part of this video, we'll look at 3 of the most brutal punishments that pirates have ever committed. Number 1. Keel hauling. This sinister practice was both a meticulous and merciless process. Captain Charles Johnson vividly explained this nightmarish punishment in his 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, writing, "The delinquent shall be stripped stark naked, and a rope tied about his middle, with which he shall be hoisted up to the end of the yardarm, from whence he shall be violently let fall into the sea, and drawn underneath the ship's keel." Generally, the tormented individuals would be thrown overboard with weights attached to their bodies. This would keep them submerged as they were dragged viciously from one side of the ship to the other. Crew members were tasked with pulling the unfortunate sailor beneath the hull against the crushing pressure of the water. Many were left with cuts and gashes after ripping their skin on the razor-sharp barnacles found on the hull. While meant as a form of punishment, keel hauling often led to the death of many unfortunate souls. Despite being used by pirates as a form of discipline, the practice was first utilized by the Dutch Navy during the 17th century. Keel hauling as a term stems from the Dutch word Keelhauling, which means to haul under the keel. The Dutch were known for their naval prowess during the golden era of piracy and were notorious for employing this punishment to keep their sailors in line when at sea. It's difficult to imagine the true horror of such punishments from the comfort of our homes. While it may send chills down our spines thinking of the poor individuals who went through such excruciating pain at the hands of pirates, it's highly unlikely we will ever witness such a thing in person. But this cannot be said for those living during the golden era of piracy. Writing several centuries ago, a correspondent for the London Morning Visitor bore witness to such a grueling event. What he saw was the inhumane practice of keel hauling. Writing about his experience, he said, "Yesterday I tried to write a description of a most horrible sight. It was so revoltingly cruel, so barbarous, so brutal, that I gave it up." Number 2. Gibbetting. For those convicted of severe crimes aboard a vessel, they would be met with a terrible fate: death by hanging. But the practice of gibbeting was no ordinary execution. In a cold-hearted fashion, the unfortunate pirates were executed by hanging on a gibbet erected close to the low water mark by the sea or a tidal section of a river. Their bodies would be left dangling until they had been submerged by the tide 3 times. Such a sight would strike fear into even the bravest individuals as they looked upon the lifeless corpses swaying in the wind. But gibbeting wasn't just a practice utilized by pirates. In fact, some historians argue that nations such as Britain used it more frequently to instill fear in the criminally minded. In this manner, gibbeting served as a public execution and was reserved for criminals convicted of unusually heinous crimes or others of whom the authorities wished to make examples. One famous pirate who met his demise with this punishment was Captain William Kidd, apprehended by Boston forces in 1699. 2 years later, he was tried at the Old Bailey in the City of London and convicted on charges of piracy and murder. For this pirate, the jig was up. On a cold spring morning in 1701, with his hands bound, he was marched to his death at sunset. During the first attempt, the rope snapped, which must have instilled some form of hope in the aging pirate's mind. But during a second attempt, the so-called arch-pirate and common enemy of mankind wasn't as lucky, and he met his end. After he died, his body was covered in tar and stuffed into an iron gibbet cage that had been made to order, which aimed to send a message to other pirates. He was placed at Tilbury Point, located on the lower part of the Thames River, and remained on show for 3 years in what would have been a truly chilling sight. Kidd was then removed and buried away from the public eye. Number 3. Marooning. For pirates found guilty of serious crimes such as theft, cowardice, or mutiny, their fate was often sealed with a heinous punishment known as marooning. Essentially, this was a delayed death sentence, a private form of death row, if you will. The convicted was left alone on a remote island and given nothing but a keg of water and a pistol. In some instances, they were even stripped of all their belongings and clothes before being deposited in their final home. An alternative form of punishment saw the culprit placed in a small rowboat with no oars. The marooned individuals were fully aware they would eventually die from either starvation or dehydration, and so many simply asked to be shot straight away. For those who couldn't yet bear the thought of death, they were given the pistol, which enabled them to end their misery before they went mad from the privations associated with isolation on an island. Various written accounts detail those who succumbed to such a horrible fate. The most famous of them was Alexander Selkirk, who was left on the Juan Fernandez Islands in the Pacific in 1704. The sailor was sentenced after arguing with the captain about the vessel's seaworthiness. According to the stories, Selkirk is claimed to have said the ship was dangerously leaky and needed repairs before continuing their voyage. When the captain, Thomas Stradling, refused to make repairs, Selkirk said he would rather stay on the island than risk his life on the ship. So, the captain marooned the former sailing master, leaving him on the island with minimal supplies, including a musket, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, a Bible, bedding, and some clothes. Selkirk initially hoped the crew would side with him, but when they didn't, he begged to be let back on board. Stradling refused, and Selkirk watched the ship sail away. Luckily, he was one of the few who survived such an ordeal. Selkirk managed to build a small shelter and even hunted food before being rescued in 1709. Most who were marooned weren't as lucky as Selkirk, and many met their demise on the isolated islands. By the 18th century, more formal forms of punishment, such as imprisonment, replaced marooning. Despite this, the fear of being exiled to an isolated island lived on for many decades in the minds of pirates and sailors. The British Royal Navy implemented a new law in 1720 that officially outlawed marooning as a punishment. However, the last recorded instance would come more than a century later in 1822. The Spanish pirate Benito de Soto exiled several members of his crew to a small island in the Atlantic. The chilling and downright horrifying punishments laid out in this video may be a thing of the past, but they speak to the practices of a bygone era. Looking back, we might define such punishments as inhumane, but to those living in the era, it was common practice to convict and sentence criminals in this manner. Had we lived during the golden era of piracy and lost a loved one or our vessel to the ill-natured actions of a band of pirates, we'd most likely seek justice in the form of one of the previously mentioned punishments. It could also be said that only by realizing how harsh and cruel these older practices were could we pave the way for more humane ways to penalize criminals in the modern era. The inhuman horror of history's most brutal pirate punishments will remain an integral part of our shared past. We can look back and explore how much we have grown as individual societies and learn from our mistakes so that instead of damnation, we may be able to reform many of the world's worst criminals.